The cards scattered across the studio floor like fallen leaves. Steve Harvey stood frozen, his microphone dangling from his hand, staring at a 71-year-old woman whose words had just stopped America's most beloved game show dead in its tracks. The audience of 300 people held their collective breath as Betty Thompson wiped her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days, just like everything else in her carefully managed life. It started as a routine Tuesday afternoon taping at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The autumn light filtered through the high windows, casting warm shadows across the polished stage where Steve Harvey commanded attention in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. The energy was electric, as always. Two families faced off. The Thompson family from rural Georgia and the Rodriguez family from bustling Miami. Standard setup, standard energy, standard expectations for an hour of wholesome entertainment. Betty Thompson stood at the end of her family's podium, barely 5 feet tall, wearing a navy cardigan that had been carefully mended at the sleeves. Her silver hair was styled simply, pinned back with a small barrette that caught the studio lights. There was something immediately endearing about her presence, the way she clutched her purse with both hands, the gentle smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. At 71, she was the oldest contestant that day, brought by her niece's family, who thought a game show appearance might lift her spirits. During the family introductions, Steve had knelt down to Betty's level, as he always did with shorter contestants. His trademark warmth was genuine as he asked about her hobbies, expecting the usual responses: gardening, cooking, church activities. But when Betty answered, something in her voice made him pause. "I take care of cats," she had said simply, her voice barely audible over the studio audience's enthusiastic applause. "Old cats that nobody wants anymore." Steve's smile had lingered a moment longer than usual. There was something in her tone, a weight that suggested stories untold, sacrifices unmeasured. But the show moved on, energy building, families competing, laughter flowing like always. The game progressed normally through the first 3 rounds. The Thompson family trailed slightly, but Betty had surprised everyone with quick, thoughtful answers. When asked to name something that makes people feel needed, she had confidently answered, being someone's only hope, earning the #1 spot on the board, and a warm cheer from the audience. But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The question seemed innocent enough. Name something people sacrifice for love. Betty stepped forward to the podium. The studio lights caught the small gold cross around her neck, a piece of jewelry so worn the engraving had nearly disappeared. She paused longer than usual, her weathered hands gripping the podium's edge. Something shifted in her expression, a shadow crossing her face as if she was calculating something in her mind. "Everything," she whispered into the microphone, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the usual audience chatter. "Everything," Steve announced, gesturing toward the board. "Survey says." The answer wasn't on the board. Strike 1. But Steve didn't move to the next family member. He stayed focused on Betty, noticing how her shoulders had begun to shake slightly, how she was staring at something beyond the cameras, beyond the studio, into a place only she could see. "Mrs. Betty," Steve said gently, stepping closer to her. "You all right?" That's when she looked up at him, and Steve saw something that made his entertainer's mask slip completely. It was exhaustion. Not the tired feeling after a long day, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. "I spend $400 every month," Betty whispered, her voice barely picking up on the microphones. $400 on 18 cats. My social security check is $680. The studio fell silent, not the dramatic silence of television, but the organic quiet that happens when people instinctively know they're witnessing something profound. Steve set down his cards and walked directly to Betty. Behind him, the Rodriguez family watched with growing concern, their competitive instincts replaced by human compassion. The cameras continued rolling, but everyone in that studio, understood that this had stopped being a game show. "Tell me about them," Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance, all entertainment value. This was just Steve Harvey, the man, talking to a woman who clearly needed someone to listen. Betty's composure crumbled. The tears came slowly at first, then with increasing intensity as words began pouring out. "They're old," she said. 16, 17 years old. "The shelters won't take them, because nobody adopts senior cats. They just put them to sleep." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photo. Even from a distance, the cameras caught glimpses of cats in various stages of age and infirmity, curled up on blankets, looking directly at whoever was taking the picture with the trust that only comes from being truly loved. "I take my grocery money," Betty continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I buy their medicine instead of my blood pressure pills. I heat their room instead of mine, because if I don't take care of them, who will? They're dying, and they're scared, and they just want someone to love them while they still can." Behind the scenes, a producer made a decision that defied every network expectation. Keep the cameras rolling. Don't cut away. The world needed to see this. Steve looked at the photo Betty held with trembling hands. His expression changed completely. This wasn't the entertainer Steve Harvey anymore. This was Steve Harvey, the father, the man who understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for something you love. "How long have you been doing this?" Steve asked. 7 years, Betty replied. "Since my husband died and left me alone in that house. I started with one cat, an old tabby someone dumped behind the grocery store. She was so thin, so scared. I couldn't walk away." The audience was completely silent now. Several people in the front row had tears streaming down their faces. The Rodriguez family had abandoned their competitive stance entirely, watching this unfold with the reverence people show in the presence of something sacred. "Now I have 18, Betty continued. "All of them old, most of them sick. I've got one that's blind, 2 with kidney disease, 1 with only 3 legs. The vet bills are..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But when I see them sleeping peacefully, when they purr when I pet them, when they look at me like I'm their whole world, I know why I'm here." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his pocket square. Without saying a word, he gently wiped the tears from Betty's face. The same gesture he would make for his own mother. "Betty," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "how much do you spend on yourself each month?" Betty looked down at her worn shoes, her mended cardigan. "Maybe $60, she whispered. "For food, utilities, whatever's left after the cats." That's when Steve Harvey did something unprecedented in the history of Family Feud. He stopped the game entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, turning to address the studio audience. "We're going to do something different today. This isn't about points anymore. This isn't about winning a game. This is about recognizing a real-life angel who's been walking among us." He walked to the Rodriguez family podium. "Rodriguez family, would you mind if we stop this game right here? Mrs. Betty needs something more important than prize money. She needs to know that she's not alone." Carlos Rodriguez, the family patriarch, didn't hesitate. "Steve, you do whatever Mrs. Betty needs. Some things matter more than games." Steve walked back to Betty and did something that no game show host in television history had ever done. He began removing his suit jacket, the expensive charcoal gray jacket that had become part of his television persona, and gently placed it around Betty's small shoulders. "Betty," he said, his voice now clearly audible throughout the silent studio, "I want you to keep this, and I want you to know something. You're not just taking care of cats. You're keeping love alive in a world that sometimes forgets what love looks like." The audience rose to their feet, not because they were prompted, but because they couldn't remain seated. This wasn't applause for entertainment. This was recognition of something profound, something that connected every person in that studio to their own capacity for love and sacrifice. But Steve wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. Not a prop, but his actual card, the one he gave to people who mattered. "This has my personal number," he said, pressing it into Betty's hands. "Not my manager's number, not my assistant's number, mine. Because what you're doing, the way you're loving those forgotten souls, that's what this world needs more of." The cameras captured everything. Betty's tears, Steve's emotional embrace, the standing ovation that seemed to last forever. The Rodriguez and Thompson families united in the center of the stage, no longer competitors but witnesses to something extraordinary. 3 months later, when the episode finally aired, it became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's history. More importantly, it generated over $500,000 in donations to senior cat rescue organizations across the country. Betty never needed to spend her grocery money on cat medicine again. The outpouring of support from viewers ensured that both she and her 18 elderly cats received the care they deserved. Steve's foundation established a trust fund specifically for senior pet care, with Betty as its first and most treasured recipient. But perhaps the most profound change was in Steve Harvey himself. That episode taught him that sometimes the most powerful moments in television aren't scripted, aren't planned, aren't about entertainment at all. They're about recognizing the extraordinary love that ordinary people carry in their hearts, often hidden from the world, always deserving of recognition. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling revealed even more about both Betty Thompson and Steve Harvey. While the audience slowly filed out, Steve remained on stage with Betty. He wasn't ready to let this moment end. "Betty," Steve said quietly, "what you've been doing for 7 years, that's not just kindness. That's ministry. That's what real love looks like when nobody's watching." Betty looked up through her tears. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy. My neighbors think I am. They say I should put them in shelters. But when I look at them sleeping so peacefully, I know I can't abandon them. They've already been abandoned once." Steve made another unprecedented decision. He turned to his production team. "I want to visit Betty's house," he announced. "Before this episode airs, I want to see what real love looks like." 2 weeks later, Steve Harvey's SUV pulled up outside a modest white house in rural Georgia. As he approached the door, he heard something that made him pause, the gentle purring of cats, who knew they were safe. Betty opened the door, wearing the same mended cardigan, but with brightness in her eyes. "Mr. Steve," she said, "welcome to our home." What Steve saw inside changed him forever. The living room had been transformed into a cat sanctuary. Soft blankets covered every surface. Medical supplies were organized with precision. Everywhere, elderly cats dozed peacefully. "This is Oliver," Betty said, stroking a one-eyed tabby. "He's 19. Someone threw him from a car 3 years ago. And this is Princess." She gestured to a 3-legged calico. "The vet said 6 months to live. That was 2 years ago." Steve knelt as an ancient gray cat limped over, purring despite obvious pain. "His name is Miracle," Betty said softly, "because that's what it was when I found him behind the dumpster, too weak to lift his head." Steve spent 3 hours meeting each cat, hearing each rescue story. He saw Betty's bedroom, which contained only a single bed because the rest was devoted to cats needing nighttime care. But what moved Steve most was Betty's medicine cabinet, where most people stored their prescriptions. Betty had bottles labeled with cat names. Her own blood pressure medication sat in the back, half empty because she'd been rationing it. "Betty," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've been making yourself sick to keep them healthy." Betty shrugged. "They don't have anyone else, Mr. Steve. When you're the only thing standing between life and death for 18 souls, you don't really have a choice." That evening, Steve called an emergency meeting with his foundation's board. By week's end, they had established the Betty Thompson Fund for senior pet care. By month's end, veterinarians across Georgia were donating services. By year's end, Betty's story had inspired similar programs in 47 states. The episode aired 6 months later. Steve insisted on a special introduction. "What you're about to see isn't entertainment," he said. "It's a reminder of what real love looks like. This is Betty Thompson's story, but it could be yours. Because we all have the choice to save forgotten souls." The response was overwhelming. Family Feud phone lines crashed from call volume. Social media exploded with Betty Thompson stories. Senior pet shelters reported unprecedented adoption rates. Perhaps the most touching response came from Betty herself. "I thought I was just keeping 18 cats alive. I never imagined I was keeping hope alive for millions." Today, 3 years later, Betty Thompson still lives in that modest white house. 16 of her original cats lived out their remaining years in comfort, passing peacefully surrounded by love. 2 new elderly rescues have joined the family. The jacket Steve gave Betty hangs framed in her living room, next to photos of all the cats she's loved and lost. And every morning, when she wakes to care for her current family, she remembers that afternoon when a game show host looked into her heart and saw not sacrifice, but love in its purest form. Because that's what happened when a 71-year-old woman taught a television studio that real wealth isn't measured in money, but in the number of forgotten souls you choose to save. Share and subscribe.